This next proposal is the result of a few years' worth of work from the Regular Season Formats Task Force. This group has been organized and has been working towards looking at all regular season formats across all of our sports in the NAIA to address a variety of challenges and concerns that have been raised related to student-athlete health and wellness, impact on academic success and performance, as well as things like cost and overall burden on athletic department staffs and student-athletes. The result of this conversation is resulting in this proposal, which seeks to address some things related to how our current regular seasons are structured in a number of sports in three primary ways. So in some of these sports, we will see reductions in the total maximum contest limit, or the maximum amount of games or competitions that a particular sport could play in within a given academic year. In other cases, we'll see that there is a recommended start date, or the earliest date on which practices for particular sports could occur. And in other cases, we'll see that there are start dates for games or for competitions, so the earliest date at which competitions for that particular sport could occur. So as it relates to game limits, we will see reductions in the sports of baseball and softball, both men's and women's basketball, cross country, men's and women's golf, men's and women's volleyball, and wrestling. Each of those sports is being recommended to have some amount of game or contest reduction. In addition, in the area of practice start dates, we do see some recommended start dates in a handful of sports. So most notably, we see this in a number of fall sports. So the reason for fall sports is that we recognize that there was becoming a real conflict between the time at which athletics were coming back on campuses and the burden or the drain that put on the institution in being able to facilitate those athletes in coming back to campus quickly enough. Noting that must be balanced with a recognition that those student athletes have to have time to acclimatize and get in shape prior to competitions. So there are specific dates in each of these cases. With our fall sports, we see that most of the fall sports, meaning cross country, men's and women's soccer, and volleyball, have practice start dates of 17 days before the team's first allowable competition. That does not mean the day on which that particular team has its first game, but it means 17 days prior to the date on which that sport could first schedule a game. So 17 days prior in most of those fall sports. The exception to this would be football, which has a recommended practice start date of 24 days prior to the first game. Recognizing that in football we do have some specific guidelines about a phased-in acclimatization approach, and that training and conditioning is certainly a concern with that sport in particular for a variety of reasons. So that relates to our fall sports. In our winter sports of wrestling and basketball, we see practice start dates of 35 days prior to those sports' first allowable competitions. Again, this is not that particular team's first game. This would be when that sport could first schedule a competition, a game, or a wrestling date. And the reason that that's a longer or extended time period is in recognition that you don't see that same kind of a conflict that we do when we're talking with the fall sports. But we do want to rein it in a little bit so that we don't have our basketball teams beginning practice in August as an example. So those are the sports where we see a start date recommended for practices. Now for games, we see start dates recommended for fall sports, winter sports, and spring sports. So for our fall sports, we see that all of those fall sports of cross country, football, soccer, and women's volleyball would all be able to schedule their first competition on the fourth Thursday in August. Now the reason for this specific date is kind of balancing with how the Labor Day weekend falls and how that's oftentimes a key point in the athletic calendar of scheduling related to various tournaments and things like that. And recognizing that as we looked at calendars over a 10-year period, what are the variety of possible ways that the calendar could fall and how Labor Day can match up and all of those things. Recognizing that some years that date could be later and some years it could be earlier. The task force came back to the fourth Thursday in August being a key day to ensure that there is enough time to get in competitions in a number of these fall sports in an appropriate time frame as we kind of work our way towards the national championship time period. So for all of those fall sports, the fourth Thursday in August would be the first allowable date to schedule a competition. It does not mean that a team is required to schedule a competition that date. Rather, it's just the first time at which you would be able to. For our winter sports of basketball and wrestling, the start date for competition would be the last Thursday in October. So again, this is kind of circling around a weekend. Here we recognize that November 1st seems to be about an appropriate time to begin competitions in those sports, but we also recognize that there may be tournaments or other things that might start on a Friday or even a Thursday. So you'll see Thursday as a theme throughout all of these start dates for games for that exact reason. So basketball and wrestling is the last Thursday in October. And then as we move on to our spring sports of baseball, softball, and men's volleyball, and the three of those sports, the earliest date at which you could schedule those spring competitions would be Thursday of that last weekend in January. Again, it's kind of recognizing that somewhere around February 1 is when we often see competitive schedules starting or kind of needing to begin, but we want to make sure that teams have that full final weekend of January to kind of count from. So that's why you see a little bit of a change in terms of how each of these seasons is described. For all other sports that I did not mention, there is not any recommended change to the game limits or practice or game start dates. So just those sports that I have described here. One other key thing that I should mention related to our spring sports and game start dates is this proposal would not prevent those sports, so baseball or softball as an example, from playing in competitions in the fall. We know that a lot of our baseball teams may play fall games, fall competitions. That's absolutely permitted and can be done anytime after August 1st. So rather, when we turn from the fall term to the spring term, you would not be able to start competitions on January 8th. You would need to wait until that last Thursday in January to start those.